My father was mid-sentence, turkey grease still on his fingers, pointing at me across the Thanksgiving table, when he picked up my phone. He didn't ask. He never asked. He just reached over like everything I owned was available for his inspection the way he always had, my whole life. I watched him swipe across the screen. I watched his eyebrows pull together. I watched the color slowly, completely drain from his face. 14 relatives were sitting at that table. My mother, my sister, my aunts and uncles and cousins who had heard him call me a failure every single year for the past 6 years. And not one of them said a word as my father set my phone back down on the table with a hand that wasn't quite steady anymore. He looked at me, really looked at me, like he was seeing me for the first time. And I just picked up my fork, cut into my sweet potato, and said, "Everything okay, Dad?" That moment, the silence that followed, was 6 years in the making. This is how it happened. I need to take you back to understand what that table really meant. Not just the food, or the decorations, or the tradition of it. I need you to understand what it felt like to walk into my parents' house every November and know with absolute certainty that before the night was over, my father was going to say something that would hollow me out. My name is Marcus. I'm the middle child. My older sister Denise is 4 years ahead of me, and from the time we were teenagers, she was the one my parents held up like a trophy. Straight A student. Married at 26. First house at 28. By the time she was 32, she had 3 properties, 2 rentals, and the house she lived in. My parents talked about Denise's real estate portfolio the way some families talk about military service. With reverence, with pride, like it was a moral achievement, not just a financial one. I took a different road. After college, I moved to the city. I worked in finance, not the glamorous kind, not Wall Street, but behind-the-scenes institutional analysis work that paid well and required me to stay flexible, stay mobile. I rented an apartment because it made sense for my life. I traveled for work. I moved firms twice in 5 years. Renting wasn't a failure, it was a strategy. But try explaining strategy to a man who measures worth in square footage. My father, Gerald, built a small construction business from nothing. I respect that. I genuinely do. He came up in a generation where you planted your flag in the dirt and you stood on it. A man who rented was a man who hadn't committed, hadn't rooted himself, hadn't proven anything. That was his worldview, and no amount of logic was going to shake it. So I stopped trying. I showed up every Thanksgiving, sat in the same chair, ate the same food, and waited for the moment he would remind the room that I was the one who hadn't figured it out yet. My mother, Patricia, was quieter about it, but no less consistent. She had a way of sighing when my name came up in certain conversations. A soft, private exhale that said everything without saying anything. She loved me, I believed that, but she had chosen, a long time ago, to interpret my life through my father's lens. And my sister Denise never corrected them. Not once. She would sit there in her blazer, wine glass in hand, and let the comparison land. Sometimes she'd even add to it. Marcus has always marched to the beat of his own drum, she'd say, which, in our family, was not a compliment. That was the table I sat at every year. That was the audience. That was the dynamic. And for 6 straight Thanksgivings, I absorbed it. I smiled. I deflected. I drove home alone afterward and stared at the ceiling and told myself it didn't matter. But it did matter. Of course it did. It wore something down in me, year by year, the way water wears down stone. Not breaking it, just slowly reshaping it into something quieter and harder. The first sign that things were shifting came about 3 years before that Thanksgiving. I'd been promoted at work. A significant jump, senior analyst, then portfolio manager within 18 months. My income changed substantially. And I found myself doing what I'd always done with money, studying it, understanding it, following it to where it actually grew. I started looking at real estate not because I wanted to live in it, but because I understood it as an asset class. I was already analyzing commercial real estate trusts at work. The residential side felt familiar. So I started quietly. No announcements, no conversations with family. I just started looking. The city I lived in was expensive, but 40 miles east, there was a suburb that was quietly transforming. An old industrial corridor that had been rezoned. New infrastructure coming in. I spent 4 months studying that market before I made a single move. I brought in a partner, a colleague named Dre, who I trusted completely, and we acquired our first property. A multi-unit building. 6 units. We renovated it over 8 months and had it fully leased within 30 days of listing. I never told my family. Not because I was hiding it exactly, but because I knew what would happen if I told them too early. My father would have opinions. He would want to inspect it, advise on it, and take some ownership of the decision. My mother would worry. Denise would compare it to her portfolio in ways that would make it feel like competition. I didn't want any of that energy near something I was still building. So I kept it separate. It was mine. Quiet and mine. Over the next 2 years, Dre and I acquired 3 more properties. Then, I went solo on a 5th. By the time that Thanksgiving came around, the one I'm telling you about, I had ownership stakes in properties that generated more monthly income than most people earned at their jobs. And I was still renting my apartment in the city. Still, by every visible metric my family could see. The same Marcus who hadn't figured it out. I knew something had shifted in the family mood about 8 months before that Thanksgiving. My father had mentioned, casually, that he and my mother were looking into some investment properties. Retirement was coming. The construction business had provided well, but it wasn't passive income. They wanted something to carry them forward. Denise had apparently been advising them. She'd connected them with her real estate agent, walked them through a few properties, encouraged them to think about buying a rental in the suburbs. My father was enthusiastic in a way I hadn't heard him in years. He talked about it at Easter like a man who had discovered fire. I listened. I asked a few careful questions. And then a few weeks later, Dre mentioned something that stopped me cold. He said, "Hey, isn't your dad's name Gerald Webb?" I said yes. He said, "He just applied to rent a unit in the Clarkson building." The Clarkson building was one of mine. I want you to sit with that for a second. Because when Dre said it, I didn't react right away. I just went very still. My father had applied through a property management company, through the normal channels to rent a unit in a building I owned. He had no idea. Why would he? My ownership was structured through an LLC. My name wasn't on the listing. As far as he knew, he was renting from some faceless investment company. I told Dre I'd handle the application personally. I reviewed it. My parents were qualified tenants. Good credit, steady income, clean history. There was no legitimate reason to deny them. And I want to be clear, I had no plan at that moment. I wasn't plotting anything. I approved the application. They got the unit. They moved in a few months later. And they called me that same week, excited, telling me they'd found a great place. A really well-managed building, my mother said. The management company is very professional. I said that was wonderful. I asked if they were settling in okay. I said nothing else. Thanksgiving came like it always did. I drove out to the family home. My parents had kept the house even after leasing the new unit. It was their weekend and holiday base, and I walked in carrying a bottle of wine and a pie I'd picked up from a bakery near my apartment. The house smelled like it always did. Roasting meat and candles, and that particular warmth of a space that holds 30 years of memory in its walls. My Aunt Cheryl hugged me first. Then my Uncle Ronnie. Cousins I only saw twice a year. Denise was already there, naturally, standing near the kitchen island with her husband Trevor, who was a good man and largely stayed out of the family dynamics with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned to read the room very early in their marriage. My father was in the living room. He greeted me with the handshake he always gave me, firm, brief, and the kind of handshake that communicated assessment rather than warmth. "Marcus," he said. I said, "Hey, Dad. You look good." He nodded once, like he was filing the information, and turned back to the football game. The meal came together the way it always did. My mother had been cooking since the night before. The table was full turkey, stuffing, collard greens, macaroni and cheese, candied yams, green beans, rolls. The kind of spread that took all day and tasted like it. We sat down. My father said grace. And for about 20 minutes, things were fine. Then Denise mentioned that she was closing on a fourth property in January. Her husband said they were thinking about expanding out of state. My father lit up. He asked questions. He leaned forward. The table followed his energy, the way rooms always followed his energy. He was that kind of man. Someone whose attention felt like a spotlight. When he was interested, everyone was interested. And then, right on schedule, he turned to me. "What about you, Marcus? Still in that apartment?" I said yes. "Still renting?" I said yes. He shook his head, the small, slow shake that he'd perfected over years. 6 years, he said. 6 years of paying somebody else's mortgage. He looked around the table. 14 people. "You know what equity is? You know how much you've thrown away?" I said I was familiar with the concept of equity, yes. He didn't like that. He set his fork down. "Don't get smart. I'm being serious. Your sister just told us she's closing on her fourth property. You're a smart man, supposedly. What are you waiting for?" My mother made a small sound. Affirmation disguised as concern. Denise looked at her plate, but the corners of her mouth moved. I said I was happy with my situation. He said happiness didn't build wealth. I said I thought it mattered quite a bit. He said that was exactly the kind of thinking that kept me exactly where I was. 14 people at that table. 14 people who heard him, year after year, tell me I hadn't built anything. I looked at my plate. I picked up my fork. I decided, in that moment, that this was the last year. Not because I was going to blow up the dinner, I wasn't. But because I was done carrying this quietly. Whatever happened next, I was going to let it happen. And then my phone buzzed on the table. I'd left it there stupid, in retrospect, or maybe not stupid at all, depending on how you look at it. It lit up with a notification. My father, sitting 2 seats down, saw the screen before I could reach for it. His hand moved faster than mine. He picked it up. "Dad." My voice was flat. He squinted at the screen. "What is this?" He turned the phone toward me. It was a notification from my property management app. Rent collection summary. Monthly deposits. Property addresses. And right there, second from the top, the Clarkson building. The address my parents had moved into 8 months ago. He knew that address. Of course he knew that address. It was his home. He scrolled. I didn't stop him. I just watched. The silence that fell over that table was different from the usual Thanksgiving silences. This one had weight. My father's face went through several things: confusion, then recognition, then something I had never once seen on his face when he was looking at me. Something that might have been awe. Or shame. It was hard to tell the difference, in that moment, on him. He set the phone down, slowly, like it was fragile. "Marcus." His voice was different. "Everything okay, Dad?" He didn't answer. My mother looked between us. "What? What is it?" He didn't answer her either. He just looked at me, and I looked back at him. Calmly, evenly, with 6 years of Thanksgiving dinners sitting quietly behind my eyes. "You own the Clarkson building," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I have a stake in it, yes. That's where your mother and I." "I know." The table had gone completely still. Denise had put down her fork. Her husband Trevor was very carefully studying the middle distance. My Aunt Cheryl looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It was somewhere between surprises and something that looked a lot like pride. My father sat back, in his chair. A man who had filled every room he'd ever sat in suddenly didn't know what to do with his hands. "Why didn't you tell us?" His voice was lower than I'd ever heard it. "You never asked what I was building," I said. "You only ever asked if I was still renting. I want to tell you what happened next. But first I need to tell you what happened inside me in that moment. Because the moment wasn't triumphant the way I thought it might be. I had imagined, if I ever imagined it, that revelation would feel like winning. Like finally. But sitting there, watching my father try to find his footing, watching my mother's face go pale with a complicated mix of emotions, I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt like I'd been holding a weight for a very long time, and I'd finally set it down. That's different. Setting something down is quieter than winning. It doesn't feel like victory. It just feels like relief. But I also wasn't going to let it pass without being said. Not this time. I looked at my father. I said, "I've been sitting at this table for 6 years listening to you tell me in front of everyone that I hadn't built anything, that I was behind, that I was the embarrassment. I never argued with you because I didn't think it would change anything. But I want you to understand something." I paused. "I've been your landlord for 8 months. The building you've told me is the best decision you and Mom have made in years. I own a piece of that. The management you've praised as professional and responsive, that's my operation. I have ownership interests in 5 properties. I don't talk about them because I wasn't building them for this table. I was building them for myself." No one spoke. "And I'm not telling you this to embarrass you. I'm telling you because I'm done being introduced as the one who didn't figure it out. I figured it out. I just did it quietly." My father looked at his plate. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life being the authority in every room. I watched him reckon with something that had no playbook. He didn't know how to respond to this. And the silence stretched out, long and uncomfortable, and nobody rescued him from it. Denise spoke first. Her voice had a careful quality to it, measured, feeling for safe ground. "Marcus, I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "Nobody did. That was my choice. My Aunt Cheryl, bless her, started asking me about the properties. How long had I been investing? What markets? She had the warmth of a woman who understood that the best thing she could do in that moment was move the conversation forward without letting it die in the wreckage. I answered her honestly, and gradually, the table began to breathe again. But my father was quiet for the rest of the meal. That was the thing I'll never forget. A man who had narrated every Thanksgiving I could remember, opinionated, certain. The gravitational center of every gathering, sat at the head of his own table in near total silence for 2 hours. My mother kept glancing at him, then at me, then back at him, trying to find the version of events she could hold in her hands. I don't think she found it that night. I left earlier than usual, made my goodbyes, hugged my Aunt Cheryl, shook hands with people. My mother followed me to the door. She held my arm before I could go outside. "Marcus." Her voice was complicated. I'd known that voice my whole life. "Mom, I didn't know either." "I know." She looked at me for a long time. "Are you angry with me?" I thought about that. I thought about all the sighs, all the nods at the right moments, all the times she'd had the choice to say something and chosen not to. "I'm not angry," I said. "But I need you to know that it hurt. Every year. Even when I didn't show it." She pressed her lips together. Her eyes went bright. She nodded. "I love you," she said. "I love you too, Mom." I kissed her cheek. "Tell Dad I'll call him this week." I walked out into the cold November air and sat in my car for a few minutes before I drove. The neighborhood was the same one I'd grown up in. The streetlights were the same. The houses I'd ridden my bike past as a kid, still standing. Everything looked smaller than it did when I was young, the way places do when you've grown past them. I didn't feel like a winner. I didn't feel like I'd taken something from my father. But I felt, for the first time in a long time, like myself. Like the version of Marcus who had spent 3 years building something real and quiet and his, without asking for permission or validation from anyone. I started the car and drove home. My father called 3 days later. I'd been half expecting it and half dreading it. He wasn't a man who called to talk. He called when he had something to say. He said, "I owe you an apology." Flat and direct. No preamble. In its own way, that was the most Gerald Webb thing he could have done. No decoration. Just the thing itself. I said, "I'm listening." He said he'd been wrong. Not just about the Thanksgiving dinner. About the years of it. He said he had a picture of success in his head, a specific picture, built from his generation and his experience, and when I didn't match it, he'd decided I was failing instead of deciding that maybe his picture was incomplete. He said he hadn't meant to shame me. He said he knew that probably didn't undo the fact that he had. It was the most honest thing my father had ever said to me. And I want to be fair to him here, because this is a story about truth, and the truth is complicated. Gerald Webb was not a cruel man. He was a limited one. He had a framework built from a hard life, and he applied it with more force than care. That's different from cruelty, even if it doesn't feel different from the inside. I told him I appreciated him saying it. I told him I understood where he came from, even when it hurt. I told him I wanted us to be different going forward, not just a son who endured his father's opinion, but two people who actually knew each other. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That building really is well managed." I laughed, genuinely, and I think it surprised him, because he laughed too. Awkward and real, and a little startled, the laugh of a man who hadn't expected to find something funny in the ruins of his certainty. But there it was. "Thank you," I said. I worked hard on it. There's something I want to say before I close this out, because I've thought about it a lot in the months since that Thanksgiving. This story could be told as revenge. A son who let his parents humiliate him until the moment he held all the cards, and then played them. I understand why it reads that way, and I won't pretend there wasn't some satisfaction in that silence when my father set the phone down. I'd be lying if I said it differently. But revenge wasn't what I built. I built those properties because I wanted to build them. Because I was good at analyzing value and identifying opportunity, and I had the patience to wait for the right moment. I didn't buy into the Clarkson building to set a trap for my father. I didn't know he would apply to live there. Life moved those pieces into place without my help, the way it sometimes does when you've been doing the quiet work for long enough. What I learned, through all of it, is that the people who underestimate you are almost always doing it, because they can't see past their own definitions of what success looks like. My father's definition was visible, tangible. A deed with your name on it. A house you walked into every night and called yours. My definition was different. It was structural. It was the work behind the curtain, the equity that didn't announce itself, the value that compounded in the background while I lived my life. Neither definition is wrong, but neither one is the only one. I think about what those 6 years cost me, not in money, not in opportunity, but in the weight of being seen as less than I was by the people who were supposed to know me best. That weight is real. I don't want to minimize it by wrapping it in a lesson too quickly. It hurt. Year after year, it genuinely hurt. And the hurt didn't disappear the moment my father went pale over my phone screen. Hurt doesn't work that way. It dissolves slowly, the way it arrived. But I am lighter than I was. That's the truest thing I can tell you. The following Easter, we had a different kind of table. Smaller, just my parents, Denise and Trevor, me, and my Aunt Cheryl, who had become unexpectedly one of my closest confidants since Thanksgiving. My father asked me about the markets I was watching. Not in a testing way, in a genuinely curious way, like a man who had decided he might have something to learn. Denise asked about my management structure. She wasn't competitive about it. She was collegial, in the way she might have been if we'd been having these conversations for years. My mother cooked the same food she always cooked. The table smelled the same. But the air was different. At one point, my father looked at me across the table and said, simply, "You did good, son." 3 words. No performance. No audience. Just the thing itself. I don't think I answered. I think I just nodded. Some things don't need more than that. If you're watching this, and you've got a table like mine, a table where someone's been keeping score of your worth in units you never agreed to be measured in, I want to say something directly to you. You don't have to announce yourself. You don't have to defend yourself. You don't have to win an argument at a holiday dinner to prove your life has value. The work you do quietly, the decisions you make carefully, the things you build in the background without seeking permission, those are real. They count. They compound. And at some point, they speak for themselves. I spent 6 years thinking the silence was costing me something. But the silence was protecting something. It was protecting the space where I was building, undisturbed, without anyone else's voice in my ear about how it should be done. The lesson isn't that you should wait for a dramatic reveal. The lesson is that you should trust what you're building. Build it for yourself. Build it because it's right for your life, your goals, your definition of what a good life looks like. And if the day comes when the people who doubted you are living inside the thing you built well, you're allowed to feel something about that. I picked up my fork and cut into my sweet potato, and I asked my father if everything was okay. It took a while. But eventually, it was.